In the 19th chapter of the book of John, we see an interaction between Jesus and Pilate, one of the most powerful men in the Roman government at that time. Jesus had been flogged. He had been made fun of. He had a crown of thorns rammed onto his head. He was basically mistreated completely. And if you read the 19th chapter, you'll see that Jesus was delivered to Pilate. And Pilate was a kind of in a quandary. He didn't know what to do. And he asked Jesus a simple question, where are you from? And Jesus wouldn't answer him. And then Pilate, in his, I think his demeanor was, I don't understand what this person is doing because I have a lot of authority here. And he just said that. Said, don't you realize that I have the authority to either release you or to crucify you? And Jesus said something that I think is worth our mentioning right now. You only have the authority as it has been delivered from above. You only have authority because God allows you to have the authority. In spite of all the power that Pilate had, he only had the authority that God had. And secondly, God had a purpose in having Pilate where he was at that time with that authority. Now we're going to talk about somebody other than Pilate in this little video. We're going to talk about Alexander the Great. You've heard of him. I contend that he too was used of God to, and I'm just going to say it up front, to deliver a corrected theology to the Jewish people. A corrected interpretation of the way things really are. Alexander the Great was born in a small town of Pella, and his father was King Philip II. In the Greek world at that time, we had city-states, and the city-states basically had a king, and they ruled each other locally. It was kind of autonomous. Each little group was autonomous, and the king had a lot of latitude. Like, for example, Alexander's father chose to have 7 wives. And Alexander's mother was either the 4th or the 5th lady that he had married. And he had life and death authority over the people living in that city-state. Now, with one exception, Athens was not a city-state at that time. It was actually a democracy. And the individual people voted on every law that existed in Athens. Okay, that's a side note. We'll move on. But anyway, Alexander, as a young boy, was sent to school, and he learned the sciences, he learned music, and he went on in secondary education. He was actually studying at the feet of Aristotle, and you would think that, oh, I see, he was walking around and Aristotle was making observations. No, that wasn't the case. We have an archaeological find that is delivering a lot of information about Alexander as a young boy. And what they would do, there was 150 young men that would go to this school, and they were taught to be warriors. They were mistreated. It was almost like a hardened military camp. And Alexander got his abilities to train horses and to become a warrior in this school. And by the time he was 18 years old, he returned from the school, and his father put him in a very high position in the city-state surrounding Pella. And his father went off on his own journeys, doing his own battles, fighting all sorts of things, and Alexander demonstrated some unbelievable capabilities. There was a story told of Alexander being able to tame a stallion that nobody else could. Sounds like something made up, but anyway, Alexander was quite a remarkable, and I've read most scholars consider him to be one of the best military commanders in the ancient world. He, in his period of time when he was ruling, and it was a very short time, and let's talk a minute how they came about. His dad was assassinated. He was made king, and he inherited all of the military, and he went and he started taking over city-states in the Greek area. And so he's building his kingdom. And one of the things that he wanted to do is he wanted to amass an army big enough that he could go against Persia. And he could take on Persia, and he would fight Darius III. Well, that does happen. And in his, we don't want to get too lost in this, but I could bore you to tears with the history and go into each of the battles, but I won't do that to you. He defeated the Persians, and he defeated the people in India, and his kingdom was quite large. And as a very young man, he was living in Babylonia, and he died. We don't know why. We're not sure why. It doesn't seem to be an assassination, but something happened. But it is interesting to note, why did he stop with India? Well, the answer was his troops were tired of fighting wars, and they rebelled against him, and they came home. So Alexander came home, and he went to Babylonia. His idea was that he wanted to Hellenize his captured world. In other words, make Greeks out of them. And he wanted to teach them. And one of the things that he would do when he would go into an area, he would acquire knowledge about their beliefs, and those Zoroastrians, for example, and or the all of the other beliefs and doctrines that existed in Macedonia and in other areas. So he pulls this together and builds a way to communicate ideas on theology to those conquered territories. Now, God used him to deliver some changes to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people. The ancient Hebrews were concerned early on, like 800 BC or BCE or earlier than that, with dietary laws, with circumcision. They were grounded in sacrifice and the acquisition and maintaining of the Canaan, their land. Angels played no role in the old theology of the Hebrews. They were only people that delivered messages. They were nameless. Satan had no independent existence. Satan, he didn't exist in the Hebrew world. There was no heaven, there was no hell in the Hebrew world, and there was no afterlife, there was no final judgment, and nothing was mentioned of a Messiah in the early Hebrew doctrines. Nothing. And as we fast forward, Alexander, at the authority of, or being used by God, I think is a better way for me to view it, he delivered some corrections to the doctrines that existed in the Hebrew minds. Now, how did this happen? They would Hellenize, and certain people would adapt to these ideas. And for example, Sheol. The ancient Hebrews believed that Sheol was a grave, and once you die, you're dead, and that's it. There's nothing else. It's torment, and you have an existence there, but that's all that they believed in. And heaven and an afterlife and a judgment and even a resurrection was something that was foreign. But these ideas that infiltrated into the Jewish community in about 300 time of Alexander the Great to 280, 290 BCE, they started moving in, and people starting adapting to and understanding and believing in angels that had a name. They started believing in Satan having a name. They started believing in a judgment that would correct all wrongs. And these were developed by oral traditions maintained by the people and the rabbis of that time period as we move closer and closer to the time of Christ, within several hundred years, of course. Now, what happened was the oral traditions then were, rather than lose them, they were written down into a thing called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah became the written documents of the rabbinical law. And they wrote these down. So we hear about the period of silence in this time period, that the Old Testament was closed and we're done and we're finished, but it's hardly true because the Mishnah was just now being developed. And by the time Jesus existed, most of what you see in the Mishnah was accepted as absolute fact. Now, what does all of this mean? What do we take away from this? God uses whomever he wants to use to further his purposes. He used the Pilate. He used Alexander the Great, and he used others to further his purpose. These are not the chosen people he's using. He's using a Roman, he's using a Greek, and he uses all of those with whom he chooses to use to further his purposes on this earth. How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel that God is so in control and his purposes won't be thwarted, they won't be set aside, they won't be put off, and his purposes are that I am going to save mankind? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Will that be accomplished? If he can turn the head of Alexander the Great into serving his purposes, then I think it can certainly help us. God bless you as you live in the grace of Jesus Christ our Lord.